I think there's a second way of thinking about human behavior, which you could call a sociological approach or a social capital approach, that looks at a different aspect of human behavior and begins with an assumption not that people are individual, rational, selfish people, but they're social creatures. And by social creatures, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're altruistic, but they intensely care about what other people think of them. And they're always adjusting their behavior to the norms that are established within the society, within the neighborhood, within the company, within the office, in a large organization. And that's another way of motivating people. So it's really norms and bonding over material self-interest. It's sometimes referred to as social capital because if people, why do people follow norms in the first place? I think it produces cooperation, right? A norm is just a rule, and if you're going to work together, you have to have common rules that limit, your behavior and make people work together. And it has been described as social capital because it's a source of wealth. All right. Now, there's several behavioral assumptions here that are important. The first one assumes that economists assume that people are rational primarily, and the social capital approach, I think, assumes that they are emotional in certain ways. The way I like to think about this is that there are four really important social emotions, which I would say are guilt, anger, pride, and shame. All right, so when do we feel proud? You achieve something, and we get recognized, right? The recognition is important. So in other words, we are doing something that is socially approved, and other people say, hey, you're number one, you won the gold medal, you did great, right? So we feel proud. When do we feel shame? Yeah, it's the opposite, right? It's when we violate a social norm. Guilt, there's a difference between guilt and shame, which sometimes people, the guilt is supposed to be the really inner feeling, and then shame is more the social approbation. But they're both related to social norms. And then when do we feel anger?
When you're not ready to do.
Yeah, when somebody else is violating a social norm, when a criminal, hurts somebody, when somebody says something outrageous, then we feel anger on behalf of the violated social norm. We feel sympathy for victims of crime, victims of injustice. We feel angry that those people have been harmed. So the thing about all of these emotions is that they're natural. They're not learned, right? They're part of every human being's psychological makeup, because I think human beings have evolved in that fashion as social creatures, where they respond to these, feelings of adjusting to the local norms. One way of illustrating this is children on a playground. So you got a bunch of 5-year-olds on a playground, and it's very easy for them to be embarrassed, right? Why does a 5-year-old feel embarrassed? Like their cheeks turn red and they start crying, and they go off in a corner. So what causes the embarrassment?
Because he has now social already developed social feelings.
No, children feel embarrassed when they suddenly realize that they're violating one of the group norms, that they wore the wrong color to school. They didn't realize that the teacher had told them to, come in at a certain time. And all of a sudden, they feel that everybody around them is looking down on them, and, and so forth. So what's, I think, important about this is that it is easier to embarrass a child than it is to embarrass an adult. Because the adult can say, oh, damn it, I don't want to wear that color, or something like that. But what I think it illustrates is the fact that these social emotions are natural. No one teaches a child say, oh, you make your cheeks red, when you feel embarrassed. I mean, it just happens, right? It just happens. And so I think it means that this model of behavior is also deeply rooted in human nature, just like individual selfishness is rooted in human nature. And both of them are ways of motivating people to work. So you can motivate people by giving them a bonus, or you can motivate people by making them proud of what they do at work. And as we'll see, in the public sector, this becomes really important because I assume none of you went into the IAS because you thought you're all going to become millionaires, doing what you do. I mean, there's a different kind of motivation.
But a lot of us are actually.
Yeah, yeah, you can become a millionaire, but presumably that's not the primary. That's not the primary motivation. In fact, just the word public service indicates that there's a different motivation. You're a public servant because you're actually serving somebody else, which is the whole community or something to that effect. All right, so we're going to go over both of these behavioral models because they both lead to different strategies with regard to how to get people to behave better and to make organizations work. So principal agent, that's very straightforward. In the private sector, you've got a principal. It's either the family owner of a family business or the shareholders. In the case of a public company, they delegate authority to a board of directors who appoint a CEO. The CEO hires top management. Get this multi-level delegation of authority all the way down to the frontline workers in the organization. So when you talk about corruption in a private sector organization, what's going on? Basically, the agent is acting in the agent's own self-interest rather than in the principal's interest, right? So we had this big scandal, with Enron, this energy company in Houston a few years ago, where one of the vice presidents, it turned out, had set up a shell company and was diverting money from the corporate treasury into, this organization that was basically benefiting the executive and his family, and that is corruption in the public sector. The agent was not supposed to be doing that. The agent was supposed to be serving the interests of the principal, which were the Enron shareholders. I was an Enron shareholder at that time, and because of this scandal, I lost a lot of money, right? So that's the definition. And so therefore, in the corporate world, to deal with that kind of corruption, there have been all sorts of efforts to basically align the incentives of the staff or the agents with that of the principal. So in Silicon Valley, the most common way of doing that is what?
Giving equity.
Well, giving options, right? Stock options, because the worry is that the managers are going to look at their short-term self-interest over the interest of the shareholders. But if you make them big shareholders, then they've got a common interest with the principals. They become their own principals in a certain sense, right? I mean, it doesn't always work quite right, because sometimes you can sell your shares and get out, even if the company is not going to do very well and so forth. But that's the basic idea of aligning agent incentives with that of the principals. In public political system, you've got a similar set of principal-agent relations. This is in a presidential system where the people are ultimately the principal. They vote in elections. They delegate either a president in a presidential system or a legislature who then appoint a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy can then hire implementing organizations to actually do the work of the government. But again, you've got this multi-level delegation. And corruption occurs when one of the agents puts their own self-interest ahead of the interest of the principal, just like in the private sector organization. So many of the economic theorists of organizational behavior, when they've talked about how to deal with public corruption, have used this model using incentives and said, how do we align the incentives of the agents so that they do what the principal wants and not what they find personally beneficial, all right? So very simple, it's not rocket science, but that's been the primary framework in which corruption has been analyzed, at least by North American economists over the past generation. So there are a lot of strategies that have come out of this particular line of thinking. The most famous, have you ever had a new public management kind of set of reforms done in India? So this is more kind of an Anglo-Saxon thing. It really started in New Zealand in the 1980s and 90s, and the British did that in their own civil service, and Al Gore tried to do some of this in the United States during the Clinton administration in the 1990s. So new public management basically sought to treat senior government officials like corporate managers. So a corporate manager is, you write a contract, you set explicit performance targets, and you say, okay, your contract is going to get renewed if you hit those targets, and it's not going to be renewed if you don't. So the central bank governor in New Zealand had an explicit inflation target written into his service contract, and if he didn't keep inflation below, I don't know, 3% or something, he wouldn't be renewed for another 5-year term. It's one way of actually delegating more discretion, because the contract doesn't say how to get to that goal. It just says, we're going to measure you on the basis of this performance, and if you don't live up to it, you're out, right? So it's kind of treating a public sector employee not as a lifetime guaranteed, job, but as a corporation would treat an executive. And so it's really a kind of trade-off of greater individual autonomy for the decision makers in return for very strict measurement of performance. And this leads to, in the corporate sector, similar things were going on, because there's a lot of big corporations in the United States like AT&T and IBM that basically everybody thought they had a job for life, so they were looking more and more like public sector bureaucracies. And there's also this big effort in the private sector to measure performance and then to use incentives to reward good performance and to punish bad performance, right? And the logic of this is pretty obvious, and it works, it's an implementation of principal agent theory. Another idea comes from Milton Friedman, which was adding an exit option in the public sector. So if you think about public schools, they're kind of a monopoly, a state monopoly. You don't have any choice in what public school you go to. So back in the 1960s, Milton Friedman, the great libertarian economist, said, well, why don't we give parents a voucher? We'll give them an amount of money equal to what we're paying to educate them in the public school, and they can decide on their own what school to take their children to. So if they don't like the public school in their neighborhood, they can use the voucher to send their kid to a private school, to a competing public school that's better. There should be freedom of choice. So basically you get to exit out of the system if you don't like it. So has voucher, this kind of voucherization?
Different thing.
Yeah.
As we have introduced an insurance scheme, the government has hired an insurance company and pays the premium on behalf of the registered citizens for the program, and it is open to both public and private hospitals. And private hospitals also earn money. Public hospitals also earn money, like private hospital from the insurance company.
I see.
So this has worked very well.
Yeah, and so it creates more competition.
Yes, and public hospitals are doing very well because of this. Making a lot of money from this.
The flip side is in Karnataka, while on paper you have that even public hospitals can come in, the entire business is being captured by the private hospitals.
Tamil Nadu, that is not the case.
Complete in Karnataka, almost 100% is in private
But
sector.
Tamil Nadu, that is not the case.
So you are, I know.
So
In both Tamil Nadu and Kerala.
outside of hospitals, has India tried to do this in the education sector at all? No, yeah. Well, it's been extremely controversial in the United States ever since this idea was introduced. The teachers' unions really hate this idea, because basically it's telling them, if you're teaching in a bad school that's failing, the parents are going to take their money and your school may close and you may, lose a job. So they've been very opposed to it. So there are very few American school districts that actually manage to implement the full Milton Friedman idea. The other problem was religion, because in the United States, one of the big alternatives to a public school is a Catholic school, a parochial school, and a lot of people felt that using tax money to send your child to a religious school was a violation of, the separation of church and state. So for all these reasons, full voucherization never really got off the ground, although many school districts still have a system of charter schools in which a private operator is allowed to open a school and attract students that would otherwise be going to a public school to increase competition. And I think the general, there have been a lot of academic studies of this, and by and large they found that the more competition, the better, basically, right? So again, this is an effort to introduce market principles into a state monopoly. So wage decompression, this was particularly important in Africa. In many public sector systems, the reason that people are hired is not to do a job, it's basically as a political patronage payoff. And so many public bureaucracies were just packed with employees that were not expected to actually do anything. And in these systems, the wage levels were pretty flat across the whole organization, because the whole point was to get as many of your political followers jobs as possible, pay them a kind of minimum amount, but you're not going to reward good service. And so clearly, if you want to behave more like a private sector organization, you have to identify who are the good teachers, policemen, doctors, and so forth. You got to pay them more, and you got to be able to sanction the poor performers. And again, this runs into huge political opposition, because the politicians that are stuffing the public bureaucracy with their followers don't like this, right? That's how they get a political benefit. And so there's resistance there. Again, teachers, doctors, unions resist this because they don't like the idea that individuals will be singled out and rewarded for good performance, and the reverse. But nonetheless, this is, if you take incentives seriously, if you don't measure and reward good performance, that's you're not going to get better performance.
What do you mean by wage decompression here? I mean, how is that?
Well, so the basic idea was that you'll set up a wage scale where you're going to pay certain workers much more than others. You're going to spread it out, and you're going to basically use high pay to attract good service. And by the way, I probably should have put this on the list as a separate issue, but performance management has become a really big innovation in especially in a lot of American cities. You can't reward good performance if you can't measure good performance, right? And so Bill Bratton, who was the New York City police commissioner back in the 1990s, was famous for creating this system where in every police precinct there'd be a computerized readout that would every week, or day to day, give you how many crimes of all sorts were being committed. And every week there'd be a meeting of all the police commissioners, the police commissioner with all the precinct captains, and they would look at everyone's statistics from one week to another. And if somebody's crime rate started rising over a period of a few weeks, that person knew he was in trouble and was liable to be fired. And so, with computerization, it's possible to measure performance in all sorts of areas, and particularly in municipal government. Yeah.
So, but will it not lead to underreporting?
Well, so yes, that's right. The moment you start measuring this sort of thing, people immediately try to figure out how to get around it. So one of the things that happened in Atlanta last couple of years ago is that they're trying to do this in the public education system, measure school performance according to standardized tests. And this led to a big cheating scandal because the teachers realized that their jobs were on the line because of this, and therefore they had to, if they couldn't get the performance of their kids up, through legitimate means, they'll do it through illegitimate means. So that's right. Okay, let me continue here. Oh, sorry, separating the policymaker from the implementer. So this is basically outsourcing. The World Bank recommends this. I think it's actually a bit more problematic, but we can get into a discussion of this. But beginning in the 1980s, this became a big trend everywhere, that government, so here in this nice academy, your own employees, I presume, are providing these nice meals that we've been having.